Beloved friends, it's a tremendous honor to join you today from people from Blackpool, Great Crosby, Lancaster, Morecambe, Preston, St Anne's on Sea and Southport. I really think the best thing I could possibly do is speak briefly and allow you some questions. But let me just touch on a couple of things that Eric touched on, because they're interesting stories behind these. Number one, why did I give my book such positive titles? I'll tell you a little story. It's a very interesting story, a little bit glimpse behind the scenes. Chief rabbis are called on to do some unusual things from time to time. And in 2005, I was called on to do something really very strange. In 2005, we had a general election. And the Labour Party put out a couple of posters, if you remember, that the community regarded as anti-Semitic. One of them showed Michael Howard, leader of the Conservative Party, who was Jewish, looking like Fagin. Do you remember that? Charles Dickens' rather anti-Semitic portrait, for which he did subsequently apologize when a lady complained in Victorian England, and he put a much more sympathetic Jewish character in one of his later novels. And there was also a poster of Michael Howard and Oliver Letwin, who is also Jewish, as pigs with wings. And, the community said these are anti-Semitic posters. Labour Party, would you still stop using them? And when everything else fails, you turn to the chief rabbi. So they say, Chief Rabbi, you do something about it. Well, I don't know what to do about it. However, I arranged to meet the minister who was responsible for the 2005 general election campaign, a minister whom I haven't met before or since, whose name was Alan Milburn. To see Alan. And I told him that our community really didn't like these posters very much. And I said, Alan, it's really up to you whether you mind or don't mind upsetting the Jewish community. But I will tell you one thing. If you carry on with those posters, you'll lose the election. He said, why? And I told him of some research that I think almost no one in Britain knew about. There's a very interesting psychiatrist in the States called Martin Seligman, who was brought recently to Britain. You may have seen the story. American psychiatry is brought to the north of England to teach British children to be happy. Did you see this thing? You may have remembered. Martin Seligman invented something called positive psychology. It was very interesting. He suddenly realized that all psychiatry and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy was all about treating depression. So if you succeeded, you got people back up to ground level. They're in a deep hole. If you succeed, you get them to ground level. Martin Seligman said, why shouldn't we look at it the other way around? Take the people who are on ground level and lift them. And he then developed this extraordinary school called learned optimism. And the opposite, pessimism, which he called learned helplessness. And it turns out that Martin Seligman's work, like some other psychotherapists, is a bit like a secular equivalent of Chabad, of Lubavitch. Because Chabad means Chochmah, Bina, Das, the intellectual attributes of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And the view of Chabad, like these American Jewish psychotherapists, is if you change the way you think, you will change the way you feel. And if you think more positively, you will feel more positively. Now, none of that research got over to Britain because A, it's American, and Brits don't like anything American, except bad sitcoms, or good sitcoms sometimes. And B, it wasn't to do with politics, it was to do with psychotherapy. So what does a politician need with psychotherapy? And as he wonders whether he's sane wanting to go into politics in the first place. Anyway, Martin Seligman did some fascinating research. He took the acceptance addresses of every American presidential candidate for the last 10 years, for the last 10 elections, and analyzed them for their optimism or pessimism quotient. And he discovered that on that basis, he could predict the results of an American presidential election better than any opinion poll. And the result is, if you want to win an election, you have to give people hope. And if you run a negative campaign, you lose the election. So this cabinet minister, who had never heard of any of this research, was sitting on the edge of his seat. More, tell me more. And he kept me there for an hour. And do you know what? The posters never appeared again. And Labour won the election. Either I or Martin Seligman should claim any credit. So it just shows, if you want to fight anti-Semitism, sometimes the roundabout route is more effective than the direct route. It will also tell you something else. It was for that reason that back in '97 I wrote a book called The Politics of Hope. And when I can't sleep, which is quite often, I go and I surf Amazon.com. You know what that is? The internet bookshop. And the wonderful thing about Amazon.com is that it allows me to get American books. Until Amazon.com was created, you couldn't get American books in Britain. There was only one bookshop in the whole of London that got you American books. So one night, 3 years ago, I am surfing Amazon.com, and I discovered somebody else has written a book about politics with the word hope in the title. I'd never heard of this man. Who was this strange Barack Obama? But I ordered the book straight away, read it, discovered here is a kindred spirit. And when I heard that he was standing for the Democratic nomination, I had no doubt. I never had any doubt that he would win both the nomination and the presidential election, because he was about hope. And that is what the Americans wanted in that election. They didn't want more of the same. They wanted a new chapter. And because Hillary Clinton in her way and John McCain in his way, and I have no political views as the chief rabbi, I don't support anyone, I have to deal with everyone. But I knew that what they wanted was a leader who could give their generation a compelling narrative of hope. And that is how he came to win the general election. And if you care to ask what is the Jewish connection here, apart from the fact that Barak comes from Baruch, as I'm sure you know. You know this. It comes from via the Arabic and then the Swahili, so Baruch eventually Baruch. And but there's something very interesting. And let me just share this with you because it's not unconnected with I'm trying to tell you a little about how to fight anti-Semitism and what it is to be a Jew. We are reading all these stories about Yetziat Mitzrayim, yeah? And how come what should have been a journey to take a few days took how long in the end?
40 years.
40 years. Of course, they didn't have satellite navigation systems in there. Follow a rabbi, you're pretty sure to get lost. However, sometimes it takes 40 years. And Moshe Rabbeinu led that generation for 40 years but didn't get to enter the promised land. I just want to tell you a little story that no one told. And here it is. Maybe they did. in 1968, a young preacher preached a sermon in Memphis, Tennessee. He was only 39 years old at the time, but he was already world famous because he had already won the Nobel Prize for Peace. His name was Martin Luther King. He got up in the pulpit of this church, and for some reason he must have sensed that his life was in danger. The civil rights movement that he had led was beginning to crumble. People were getting impatient. He was going too slowly. He was choosing non-violent methods, and some of them believed you could only get there by violence. He knew that his life was in danger. And it may have been that sense that led him to add a paragraph to his speech that night. And that paragraph, the last he ever spoke in public, he spoke about the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he said, I have climbed the mountain, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I promise you will enter the promised land. The next day, he was assassinated. 40 years later, a black American was elected as President of the United States. Martin Luther King's dream, 40 years later exactly. And finally Barack Obama entered the promised land. And I want to explain therefore, on the basis of this circuitous route, that is what the Jewish contribution to civilization has been, and what the last chapter of my next book will be about. I say that Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of mankind. We invented hope. The Greeks invented tragedy. These are extraordinary concepts. There is no tragedy outside of Greece and its influence. There is no hope outside of Judaism and its influence. And it was not by accident that Israel is the country whose national anthem, Hatikva, actually means hope. And where do we see it in yesterday's Sedra, and where do we see it now in 2009? In yesterday's Sedra, the Israelites had to fight the first battle they ever had to fight alone. Everything else God had done for them. But once they got through the Red Sea, they were attacked by the Amalekites. And the Torah says that Moses told the people to go out and fight a battle with the Amalekites, and they did. And Moses stood on a hill so that everyone could see him, and he lifted his hands. And the Torah says, Kasher Yarim Moshe et Yadav v'Gava Yisrael. When Moses lifted his hands, Israel prevailed. V'Kasher Yaniach Yadav v'Gavar Amalek. But when he let his hands drop, Amalek started to prevail. The Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah asked the question, V'chi yedei Moshe osot milchama o shovrot milchama. Did the hands of Moses make or break war? What was it? Magic? And the Mishnah says no. When Moses lifted his hands, the Israelites looked towards heaven. And whenever they looked towards heaven, they won. When he dropped his hands, and they had to look down, they became demoralized and they began to lose. It is an extraordinary fact that the greatest empires in all history have attacked, in some cases conquered, in some cases brutally conquered, or attempted to destroy or assimilate the Jewish people. The Egypt of the Pharaohs, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, the Alexandrian Empire, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Roman Empire, all the way through to the Christian and Muslim empires of the Middle East, to the two great tyrannies of the 20th century, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. Every one of those empires seemed invulnerable in its time, and every one of them has disappeared from the arena of history, while this tiny people, our people, can still sing Am Yisrael. Why? Because we were the people who exemplified in our history to a way it is almost unbelievable. That great statement of Zechariah, Lo l'chai, v'lo b'koach, ki im beruchinu Hashem, not by might or by strength, but by my spirit, says the Lord. We never had great numbers, but we had spirit. And whenever we were inspired, we were undefeated. This brings me to the present. For 7 years, between that famous handshake in 1993 on the White House lawn, Shimon Peres, the late Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat engaged in a peace process. That collapsed on the 29th of September 2000 with the beginning of the so-called Al-Aqsa Intifada, and since then Israel has been under ceaseless assault. First by the so-called Intifada, then by a wave of suicide bombings that has had no equivalent anywhere else. They were happening daily, more than daily. And then when they finally put an end to the suicide bombing through the security barrier, the extraordinary assault of Katyushas from the north and Qassams in the south, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza. And what has been the point of these attacks? Everything the Lebanese might have wanted, they had. Israel pulled out completely from Lebanon. Everything the people of Gaza could possibly want, they had. In 2005, the Israelis pulled out of Gaza, leaving all the land, it's yours. All the factories, they're yours. All the farms, they're yours. Have it all. There was no military logic to Hezbollah and Hamas whatsoever. No military logic, no political logic, only for religious logic, that they are opposed in principle to the very existence of a Jewish state. And very early on, already in late 2000, I sat down with the then Israeli ambassador, I forgot who it was in 2000, it doesn't matter because the point is general. I said, I want you to know what Israel's enemies are trying to do. In the past, they tried to put Israel in a military crisis, and they failed. Then they tried to put, via the wars, 48, 67, 73. Then they tried to put Israel in a political crisis, and they failed. The 75 resolution. Zionism is racism. Then they tried to put Israel into an economic crisis, and they failed. Now, they are going to try and put Israel through a spiritual crisis. And they may succeed. Because that is the point of terror. It has no logic whatsoever, except to make Israelis feel terrified. To sit in a bus in Haifa, a bar in Tel Aviv, a coffee bar or a restaurant, Svaras in Yerushalayim, you don't know whether you're going to come out alive. There was time when Israeli parents were sending their kids off on school buses not knowing whether they would ever see them alive again. And of course, up in the Lebanon with the Katyushas, up in the north of Israel, with the Katyushas raining down, so that one half of the population had to leave the north of Israel and escape to the south, and the other half spent 34 consecutive days in bomb shelters. And now with the situation in Gaza, even worse, because the people of Sderot, for 7 years, non-stop, have been under a barrage of missiles and mortars, the like of which is impossible to believe. There are 7-year-old children in Sderot who have not known one moment of safety outside a bomb shelter. And it has no political or military logic. It is an attempt to break the spirit of Israel. Elaine and I come face to face with this, because each year at about this time, we're going to do it in a week's time this year, we go out with 3 chazonim and the Shabbaton choir, and we do concerts for victims of terror. We've done it for the last 6 years, and of course 2 times ago it was up in the north, and then last year in Sderot, Ashdod and Ashkelon, and this year sadly again in Sderot, Ashdod and Ashkelon. It lifts people's spirits. So that is the situation. We have our English kids being intimidated on campuses. I'm sure you saw this. 17 campuses where there have been sit-ins. Some very bad experiences at Cambridge, at Oxford, at the London School of Economics, at the School of Oriental and African Studies. There was even a sit-in where I have a chair at King's College London. The vice-chancellors have been very supportive to the Jewish students, but there's very little they can do. And it's actually very, very difficult. So, the truth is, I only wish I could find some way of talking to our enemies. Because I think I have to tell them, guys, you can do many things to Jews. You can give them aggravation. You can give them high blood pressure by giving them too much to eat. You can make a special shul for them, because any time, as you've reminded us, that you make a shul, you create machlokes. You want to do bad things to Jews, it's easy. But you try and break their spirit, guys. Think again. This is the people who lived through 4,000 years of suffering and never gave up faith and never gave up hope. The people of Israel, in the state of Israel, are the people who lived 2,000 years outside the state of Israel and never once for one day lost faith that one day they would return. So you're trying to break Israel's spirit, forget it. And I say to the radicals on Britain's campuses, you try and break the spirit of our Jewish students, forget it. Deny it. It's really bad. But our students have an indomitable spirit. And they will come through. And the moment will pass. And in the meanwhile, we will know, yet again, that you can test Israel's strength. But our strength can never be defeated. And therefore, let me just end by one little thought and then open it up for questions. You are a small community. Well, let me tell you something. We're a small people. We always were. The only trouble with the Torah is this, that Hashem tells Abraham, your children will be many. As many as the stars of the heavens, as many as the dust of the earth, as many as the sand by the seashore. But a slightly more sober estimate goes as follows. Here is Moses in one of his final addresses, in chapter 7 of Devarim. Lo merubachem, chashak Hashem bachem, uvacha bachem. Not because you are numerous did God love you and choose you. Ki atem hama'at mikol amin. For you are the smallest of all people. So we were then, we are now. The late Milton Himmelfarb said, just think about it, the total population of world Jewry is smaller than the statistical error in the Chinese census. Or as Amos Oz put it more recently, he was talking to a Chinaman and the Chinese said, you know, you Jews and we Chinese, very ancient civilizations, very important people. And Amos Oz replied, yes, we are very powerful peoples. In fact, if you add the total number of Jews in the world and the total number of Chinese in the world, we're a fifth of the world's population. So we're small. Okay, we're small. And And therefore, in a few weeks' time, we'll read a Sedra called Kitisa. And Kitisa begins with the command to count Jews. But it's a very dangerous command, because it says, Kitisa Hirosh B'nai Yisrael Ikudehem. When you come to count Jews, then they shall give Kofer Nafsham. Each one should give a half a shekel, donate a half a shekel, V'lo yeh bahem negev tifkodotam, so that there shouldn't be a catastrophe when you count them. Very interesting thing. We don't count Jews. We ask them to give, and then we count the contributions. That's how they used to do it. And I'm going to tell you something extraordinary. I'll tell you something extraordinary. Why was it dangerous to count Jews? And the answer is obvious. Why do nations take censuses? And the answer is because of the assumption there is strength in numbers. The greater the population, the more you can recruit into the army. The greater the population, the more you can get in taxes. One way or another, strength in numbers. If the Jewish people ever, for one moment, believed their strength in numbers, we would have given up years ago. That's why it's dangerous to count Jews. So how does the Torah tell us you count Jews? Ask Jews to give. And then count the contribution. Because though our numbers may be small, our contribution has been vast. And anywhere you go in the world, you ask people, how many Jews in this place? The answer they give you will be at least 10 times as many as there actually are. The reason is obvious, we make 10 times as much noise as everyone else. However, what does that mean? It means that being a small community is the Jewish condition. That's how our ancestors were. For many centuries, even the communities you think were vast were tiny. You look at the size of ancient shuls, the size of the Altneu Shul in Prague, which was a big shul. The Altneu Shul is not bigger than this. And it was one of the oldest and greatest shul of Europe. It couldn't get that many people in it. And you go to the shuls in Safat, the Ari Shul, the Rabbi Yosef Karo Shul, they're not hardly bigger than little rooms. Jews always were a tiny people. However, an important people. I once heard, have any of you been on a cruise? Sure. You've been on a cruise. I once heard from Norman Lamb the story of Mendel the waiter. Apparently, there were people on a cruise when was the Entebbe raid? 76? 76. Anyway, the raid on Entebbe, and everyone on the boat was following this through however you get news on a cruise, I don't know. And finally the news came through about this daring raid, one of the most daring events in modern times, and somehow the passengers, the crew, and the captain wished to pay their respect and admiration to the Jewish people, because they were so inspired by this raid. So they searched around the ship, were there any Jews on the ship? It turned out, I don't know, this may have been one of the only cruises. But they looked all over the ship. There was not one Jewish passenger. There was not one Jewish officer. Finally, they asked down below deck, and they discovered there is one Jew called Mendel, who was one of the waiters. So they summoned up Mendel, and very solemnly the passengers and the crew and the captain presented their congratulations and blessings to the supreme representative of the Jewish people on the ship, Mendel the waiter. Now, not all of us can be Mashiach, not all of us can be rabbis, president of the board of deputies, but we can all be Mendel the waiter. Every one of us is in some strange way an ambassador of the Jewish people. And we never know when we will be called on to explain, to defend, or to be congratulated. One way or another, each one of us is an ambassador of Israel. Let us hope that that role will bring us much pride. And above all, may we pray that speedily in our days, God will give the Jewish people in Israel and the diaspora the thing we value most of all, which is peace.